Gary Zacharias here with the Apologist bookshelf. Thanks for being part of the podcast today. Here's a book that's brand new for me. It's called The Comprehensive Guide to Apologetics. Joseph Holden is the general editor. And boy, they got some great names of people that have contributed to it. Norm Geisler, Josh McDowell, Gary Habermas, Walter Kaiser, Ron Rhodes, Edwin Yamauchi, Ed Hinson, Stephen Meyer, Randy Alcorn, William Dembski, John Warwick, Montgomery. So this is so good. Josh McDowell says it's a must-read. Norm Geisler says it's crucial. I mean, we're in a society that people tell us that you just have to go by your feelings. Well, how can we be certain of our faith if it's just based on our feelings? And how do we answer these hard questions out there posed by skeptics and searchers alike? So it's an excellent, excellent book. Just to give you an idea, it's broken into different parts. First one is questions about apologetics and truth. Good heavens, we have to defend the idea of truth these days, don't we? Part 2 is questions about God. Part 3, questions about Jesus. 4, questions about the Bible. 5, questions about science and faith. 6, questions from Christians, seekers, and skeptics. 7, questions about worldviews. And then 8, questions about apologetics of the past, which I think is really interesting. In fact, if I have time, I might dip into that one today as well. So just think about what's being covered there, just about everything. Anyway, so I can't even get into depth on it. I mean, it's 500 pages, so it gives you an idea of what's available to you here. It's rich. This is something you probably ought to have on your bookshelf somewhere. I want to do chapter 11. Natasha Crane, one of my favorite people. I've done some of her books in the past from a podcast, and I recommend anything that she puts out. So she's got a short chapter here called Why Does God Seem Hidden? And she starts off, she said, atheists are going to say, well, there's no evidence for the existence of God. There's not even a valid reason to bother looking for him. If people tell us, oh, I found God, they say, well, they're just engaging in wishful thinking. We just want there to be a God. We want there to be a father figure, a daddy out there in space that'll help us. So their belief is that God's not hidden. He doesn't exist. And she quotes an atheist author, Dan Barker. He says, I'm an atheist because there's no evidence for the existence of God. That should be all that needs to be said about it. No evidence, no belief. She also quotes atheist author Richard Dawkins. Here's what he has to say. Richard's always a good guy to go to when you want an outrageous quote from an atheist. A lot of other atheists, by the way, are embarrassed by him. They think he's more of a showboater. But anyway, here's what Dawkins had to say. Faith is the great cop-out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence. Faith is belief in spite of, perhaps even because of, the lack of evidence. Isn't that something? I mean, what a challenge there to be able to interact with that. And so Natasha says that Barker and Dawkins state this supposed lack of evidence like it's an acknowledged fact. And they just go on to claim that anybody that believes there's a God is just being thick-headed, right? It's unreasonable to do that. And she says, but we need to know that that's not a universally acknowledged fact. Neither theists nor atheists are willing to believe in something without evidence. Theists don't do that either. They believe there is evidence for God's existence, even if he's somewhat hidden, and they believe because of that evidence, not in spite of it. Okay, so I think that's really important. Let me emphasize that one more time. Atheists don't believe in something if there's no evidence. Theists don't believe in something if there's no evidence. So she said, how in the world do people draw such vastly different conclusions? She said, well, it's just the nature of evidence. Because after all, evidence doesn't really say anything. Why? You got evidence that requires human interpretation. And since it requires interpretation, there's always going to be different conclusions depending on a person's available information maybe. Could be their life experiences. Maybe it's their motivations. I mean, I've read enough things from atheists who say they don't want there to be a God. So it's motivation that leads the way there. So she said, as you go through this book, she said, just bear in mind, just because God hasn't made his existence undeniably obvious, that doesn't mean that atheist conclusion that he's given us no evidence She says the problem is that theists and atheists just disagree how to interpret the evidence. I think that's crucial. Theists and atheists just disagree over the interpretation of the evidence. So, subheading coming up, is there enough evidence of God's existence? And she said, many people are going to say, well, I'm not going to go down that road that says there's no evidence for God. I don't think the evidence is strong enough. But she says, notice that word enough. Boy, is that subjective. She said, what might be enough for one person to believe in God might not feel like enough for another person. So she said, she gets a lot of email responses in her blogs and all. So here's somebody. This is a wish list, I guess, from, she says, an atheist blogger. If I saw an unambiguous message from God, I'd be persuaded of his existence. If I saw writing suddenly appear in the sky in letters 100 feet high saying, I am God, I exist, here's what I want you to do. And if that writing were seen by every human being, written in whatever language they understood, comprehended in the same way by everyone who saw it, I'd be persuaded that God existed. Now, Crane says, I can certainly relate to that desire, but wouldn't it be great to have that kind of revelation? She said, if we were really honest, all of us would love to encounter God that way, showing up right in our face. But she said, God doesn't reveal himself as much as we like. It doesn't logically follow there's not enough evidence to conclude he exists. She says, really, we should start by asking two questions. First, is our standard of proof reasonable? And she says, think about that blogger. He was looking for absolute certainty. And she says, really? If you apply that criterion to anything else in life, there's very little that we would be able to claim we know. We lack that kind of evidence, for example, that Abraham Lincoln existed. We don't have undeniable evidence. We assume he did, based on a preponderance of evidence. So she said we shouldn't necessarily expect that evidence for God's existence is going to be different. So that's the first of the two questions she says we should ask. Here's the second one. What's the best explanation for the evidence we do have? Yeah, that's a really good question. And she says, here's some examples. The origin of the universe. What's the best explanation? And I'm going to add something here. We got two choices, don't we? Either the universe brought itself into existence or something outside of it brought it into existence. So the atheist would say it brings itself into existence. The theist, the Christian, the Jew, would say God brought it into existence. So what's the best explanation? Well, I'm going to go with the universe can't bring itself into existence. Must be a God. Okay, here's another one. She says, what's the best explanation for this evidence? The complexity of life. How do you get complex life like we have on this earth? I mean, the one great example, these little molecular motors that are going on inside of our cells, how did those come about? And she says, what about our innate moral knowledge? What's the best explanation for that? She said, these are hugely important questions. Yeah. She said, we could draw up our own list of evidence we wish God would give us, but why? I mean, that's not going to work. We need to draw our conclusions about the evidence that we have rather than what we wish we had. Does that make sense? I think so. So then she gets around to what this whole short article is about. But why wouldn't God make himself more obvious? So she said, it is reasonable. We should be asking why God would not reveal himself in more obvious ways. I mean, think about it. If God is perfectly loving and good, wouldn't he want to make his existence so obvious that nobody could deny it? Especially when people say they long to encounter him more directly? She said this question is compounded by a couple of biblical truths. One, God does want all people to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth. That's in 1 Timothy 2. And secondly, Jesus says he's the only path to salvation. That's John 14. So think about that. If our belief, if our trust in Jesus has such eternal consequence, why would God remain hidden, even a little bit? She says Friedrich Nietzsche, the great German philosopher who was an atheist, put it this way. A God who is all-knowing and all-powerful and who does not even make sure his creatures understand his intention. Could that be a God of goodness? Yeah, that's a really good question. She said, now, we only have a limited understanding of why God is revealing himself in certain ways, at certain times, in certain amounts. But she She said that philosophers have come up at least with one possible reason God may choose to remain as hidden as he does. And here it is, to preserve our free will. So what does she mean by that? Well, free will is our ability to make choices without somebody putting a gun to our heads, somebody not twisting our arms. We come to a free decision. So if God wants us to genuinely love him, he's got to give us some kind of free will. Well, what happens if we don't have free will? We're robots, and we just say, I love you to God. What kind of relationship would we have? I remember J.P. Moreland said there's a doll that says things like, I love you. And what's the point? Nobody feels that doll really cares. It's programmed to do that. So she said, we're going to be robots if we don't have free will. And that has a bearing on the question of God's hiddenness. If he revealed himself in an undeniable way, he would effectively be taking our freedom away to seek him and to love him. And so he gives us space. We can either genuinely pursue him or we can avoid him. And she quotes from Christian philosopher Blaise Pascal, who said this. And if we have a chance, I'd like to touch on something about Blaise Pascal. Remember, I said this book has sections on famous apologists of the past. So here's what Blaise Pascal said. Willing to appear openly to those who seek him with all their heart and to be hidden from those who flee from him with all their heart, God so regulates the knowledge of himself that he has given indications of himself which are visible to those who seek him and not to those who do not seek him. There is enough light for those to see who only desire to see, and enough obscurity for those who have a contrary disposition. So the Bible says that if we seek God, we will find him. That's Deuteronomy 4:29. Now, he's not going to write his name up in the sky, probably, but the verse implies that God's revealed himself in sufficient ways to allow genuine seekers to find him. So that would be things like general revelation, just looking at nature and philosophy and reasoning, and special revelation, like the Bible and the person of Jesus Christ. And then she ends up in the chapter here, but what about people who don't find God, even when they say they're looking? Does that contradict Deuteronomy? She said, well, look at Romans 1:18-20. All people know God exists, but some suppress the truth. And here it is. Here's what Paul had to say. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived, ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. So she said, we know from the Bible that some people just are not going to put their faith in God no matter how much he revealed himself. I mean, look at the Israelites. They witnessed all sorts of supernatural events. Did that keep them true and trusting of God? No. How about in the New Testament? Jesus performed all sorts of miraculous signs. There were still people that chose not to believe. That's in John 12. She says, if God skywrote today, you can bet that many would still deny his existence. So she said, really, faith in God is a matter of both the heart and the mind, no matter how hidden he may seem at any given time. Okay, so I mentioned, I think we got enough time here. We mentioned Blaise Pascal. She quotes Blaise Pascal. So I just want to mention a couple of things about him. People have said, and again, this is coming from the back part of this textbook on apologetics. He's one of the greatest geniuses of the modern world. He was a child prodigy. He was a scientist. He was a mathematician. He actually invented the precursor of a modern calculator. He wrote influential studies of geometry. One of these was published when he was 16. Oh, man. He broke new ground in areas of physics. He contributed to concepts of pressure and vacuum. It was a powerful spiritual experience he had in the mid-1600s that caused him to turn to defending the Christian faith. And so if you look at his pensée, that's an important word of apologetics, it was really unfinished. He died, unfortunately, at 39, so they just have scraps of paper with his notes, but they were profound and original aphorisms and arguments that challenged what was going on around him at that day, which was skepticism and rationalism. And so it said he urged a faith that was rational, yeah, It should be rational without being rationalist, and a faith that made sense of the world around us. So here was his argument that he wrote. Men despise religion. They hate it and are afraid it may be true. The cure for this is to first show that religion is not contrary to reason, but worthy of reverence and respect. Next, make it attractive. Make good men wish it were true, and then show that it is. Worthy of reverence because it really understands human nature. Attractive because it promises true good. I'd like to take just a second and talk about that. You know, we can do all the apologetics in the world, but if people think that Christianity is bad or it ruins human nature of some kind, why would they care about it? Why would they investigate it? So as Pascal said, we should make good men wish it were true, right? In other words, if Christianity was in effect in your life, what will it do for you in positive ways? And if we can demonstrate that, then, Pascal says, then we need to show Christianity is true. So we want to make it attractive and then show that it is true. So I think that makes a lot of sense. I have a talk on that. I'd be glad to share a PowerPoint with you if you'd like to see it, talking about the reasons, the things Christianity promises, and then we decide if it's true or not. Okay, so that's Blaise Pascal. And I think there was, he talks about, I'm going to go, I'll end on this. There's that famous Pascal's wager, and maybe you've heard of that before. He said, we all have to choose. Do we believe that God exists or that he doesn't exist? He says that choice we make is the wager that determines everything. We can't avoid making that decision, and reason alone can't do it. If we wager that God exists and we're right, then we've won eternal life. If we're wrong, we've lost nothing. But what if we wager against God? Well, there are two possible outcomes, aren't there? If we're right, there's no God, we've won nothing. Okay, so no problem. But if we're wrong, if we wager against God and there is a God, we lose everything. So Pascal says, which decision is the best bet? Is it not to stake your life on God's reality? Now, of course, that's not really proof that God exists, but it's really short and elegant. It's a good invitation for people, isn't it? So once again, this book, powerful book, a lot of people praise it. J. Warner Wallace, I like Jim Wallace. He says, in an age of competing worldviews, emerging technology, and scientific discovery, Christians must accept their God-given responsibility to make the case for truth. And this book, he says, will help you master the evidence for Christian theism as it prepares you to respond to alternative worldviews. Yeah, others say it's the most comprehensive, clearly written, useful, and informative book on apologetics they've ever read. William Dembski covers just about every question that Christians will encounter. Ron Rhodes, it's a joy to recommend this book. Some of the world's top apologists addressing the most relevant apologetic issues of our times. It's immensely helpful, somebody else said. So again, the title is The Comprehensive Guide to Apologetics, Joseph Holden, General Editor, and I hope you really seriously consider having this book on your shelf. There are, you can get by with probably 4 or 5 good books, and this would be one of them. All right, well, thank you so much for being part of this podcast, and I hope your day is going well.